For the Wild is brought to you in part by the Calliopeia Foundation. We are grateful for their continued support and the support of grassroots contributions from listeners like you. Learn more at calliopeia.org. To make a donation, visit forthewild.world/donate or find us on Patreon. If you'd like to support us in other ways, consider sharing our episodes through social media or leaving us a review wherever you listen to the podcast. Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today I'm speaking with Lil Milagro Henriquez.
Be prepared to walk incredibly humbly and gently because we are all trying to figure it out together.
Lil Milagro Henriquez is the founder and executive director of Mycelium Youth Network, an organization dedicated to preparing and empowering young people of color for climate change. Lil Milagro is a veteran of social justice organizing with over 18 plus years of experience working on a myriad of issues, including access to higher education for low-income people and communities of color, food sovereignty, environmental racism, union democracy, and labor organizing, among others. In 2017, she founded Mycelium Youth Network. She is a current recipient of the Women's Earth Alliance Fellowship. Well, Lil, thank you so much for joining us on For the Wild podcast. I'm really looking forward to diving deep with you today.
Sounds great. Walito Nali, thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you.
Thank you. So, we've been warned that in order to limit global temperatures from exceeding a 1.5 Celsius increase, we need to cut global emissions by 45% in the next 10 years. However, recent reports indicate that if our current global pledges were enacted, we'd only reduce our emissions by 1%. And so I think it should be pretty obvious by now that ourselves and future generations are going to live through what some might define as an ongoing climate emergency. So I want to begin our conversation by recognizing that we really need to focus our energy into thinking about how we can be healthy amidst unhealthy or unusual circumstances, rather than spending all of our energy on thinking about how to stop climate change-related disasters. So as an entry point into your work with Mycelium Youth Network, I wonder if you can talk about the importance of a new paradigm of education, coping mechanisms, and survival skills in context to climate change-related adversities.
That's right. And I think that thank you for that question. It's something that consistently keeps me up at night and really drives the work of Mycelium Youth Network. And for me, it is a fundamental question about how do we rethink what we are doing in education and rethink the point of education in many ways. And a lot of times what happens is what is currently happening, our business as usual model tells us that the point of education is to get a good job, to make lots of money, to, achieve the American dream in many ways. And we teach young people as if that is both where we should be going and as if that should be the model and as if the world is not going to change. And everything that you just highlighted, and there's so the issue of climate change and what's coming, it's becoming really well documented. And Mycelium Youth Network starts from the idea that we need to rethink the point of education. The point of education should not just be how do we get a good job, how do we make lots of money, how do we, quote unquote, make it as individuals, but how do we prepare young people for the world that they are already aging into? We know what is coming. We know, climate scientists have been telling us, here are all of the points that we are hitting already. And the idea that the world is going to stay the same is really false. And I think that we need to be able, as adults, to have the courage to start shifting the education and our educational model to support young people in normalizing what we know is coming and then preparing for it accordingly. And I think young people are already sensing the ways in which the education that they are receiving is not up to the task of the world that they're living in. And I think that the climate marches that have come out recently are strong indicators that young people are seeing past the hypocrisy of, studying to get a good job, to go to college, to do all of these things when the world itself is falling apart. And so I think that as adults, we need to be able to have the courage and the bravery to say, if we know what is coming is coming, what does that mean for young people from like kindergarten in terms of social emotional development, in terms of science, technology, engineering, and arts and math skills, in terms of ancestral knowledge, kindergarten through 12th grade, and start shifting what we are teaching young people and how we are teaching them so that they can actually have a chance of a better future rather than what we see now, which is only, there's a great Washington Post article that was talking about that there's only 29% of young people feel optimistic about the future. And if that is not in and of itself a reason to start shifting the way that we're thinking about education, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hear you. And I've seen so many memes on social media where young people, and honestly, even millennials, are like, what the hell? What are we inheriting? And why are the older generations not paying attention to this and thinking about our future? So I so respect what you're doing and appreciated that introduction. And I've heard you share the importance of dismantling the narrative the frontline communities, which are also often BIPOC communities, need, quote, saving. And so often these narratives also pull income into the equation while completely ignoring the wealth of wisdom that derives from BIPOC communities when it comes to tending the land, navigating failing systems, etc. So, with this in mind, I'd like to ask you how something like Mycelium Youth Network is working to change this narrative while also developing climate resilience that is rooted in ancestral traditional practices and a science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics curriculum.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's something that we try to do at two different levels. And I think that it is necessary to do it at two different levels to really be successful. And the first level that we think about it is as an organizational structure. How are we orienting ourselves with our staffing, with our board of directors, with our advisory board, with the people we bring in as partners? Like, how are we understanding the ways in which we're, in many ways saving ourselves, right? And Mycelium Youth Network is a predominantly queer, all BIPOC staff, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color staff. And our board is predominantly POC, our board of advisors is predominantly POC. And I think that we think fundamentally about what does that mean on a daily basis in terms of how we even do the work and how we are positioning ourselves in places of power, right, in our organization to be able to have a voice in what we are doing and how we are doing it. And how are we also thinking about things from a labor perspective, from a queer perspective, from an anti-ableism perspective. And so we're really trying to think into how we're also decolonizing ourselves as an organization. And I think that that's fundamental because I don't want that to get lost in also the work that we do, because I think in order to do the work that we do, we need to first be able to have a staff that feels empowered, that feels like their voices matter, that where we're bringing in voices that are traditionally considered marginalized, but which are actually incredible sources of power and knowledge to be able to make the decisions in their individual lives as workers at Mycelium. And for programmatically, what that has looked like has been us thinking deeply into our own ancestral traditions and practices and recognizing that pre-colonization, so many of our communities, so many of our peoples for generations and generations have been able to live in sustainable regenerative relationship with the land. And not even just live in a relationship with the land, but live in ecosystem, live in community, right? And so in sharing stories about plant relatives, about animal relatives, being able to understand the nature of our relationship to a much larger ecosystem. And it has been through the process of colonization that has really stripped so much of that knowledge from us, and taking a place like where my family is from, which is Cuzatlan, El Salvador. I identify as a detribalized person of Nahuatl descent, and looking at how the cities started springing up, and so people and the farms and the small villages started getting deforested, and how people left, their land in order to be able to move to the cities because they weren't able to survive otherwise. And so what we do is we say, like, what is the knowledge that we have lost through the process of colonization that our ancestors used to hold very, very close and dear to them? And how do we start recapturing some of that knowledge? How do we start recapturing the idea of what it means to live in sustainable relationship, to be able to know the songs and the stories of the birds around us, for example, or our plant relatives? And how do we infuse that knowledge and a different way of being in relationship to the world into our curriculum? And only from that place do we then start talking about science, technology, engineering, arts, and math techniques, because we want young people to feel like they don't need to be saved. They already have ancestral knowledge, which is valuable and which is needed. And actually, this is the knowledge, that traditional ecological knowledge, that ancestral cultural traditions and practices, that is the knowledge that will save us. Because even if we do every single thing right from a STEAM perspective, from a science perspective, we are still going to go over the climate cliff. And so how do we actually recapture some of what that knowledge means, start developing a different way of being in relationship to the world, to each other, to ourselves, and then be able to think about solutions on top of that? But then the solutions themselves would shift and change based on the conversations that we're having, that are forefronting and empowering that ancestral knowledge.
Mm. Wow. Thank you. That was really beautiful. And yeah, it's clear that Western science is not only failing in its approach to navigating climate change, but it's also part of the problem. So I'm wondering, how does developing a curriculum that incorporates both STEAM and ancestral knowledge move us into a much more comprehensive way of being in the world than what the Western academic paradigm has provided us thus far, which is largely just overwhelming data?
And I will say before I answer this question that my history, not a little bit, my history really comes from one of organizing and one of recognizing that numbers do not move communities. Numbers do not move people. Data doesn't make people take an action on something. What allows them to feel empowered to take action on something is stories, it is connection, it is feeling this more holistic, comprehensive approach to an issue. And so when I think about just having what is, classified as Western science, I think of it as really siloed knowledge that feels really abstract, both in my life as well as in the lives of the students that we're talking to, our larger community. And so if we're just operating from a place of siloed knowledge, then we're not moving people to actually shift and change. And what Mycelium really tries to do is we try to create a system where we're understanding that if this is a comprehensive, if climate change is a comprehensive, large issue and problem, then our solutions need to match it with comprehensive, holistic ways of being and knowing in the world. And I think that for us, that means that we do look at science. Our students are taught how to read National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. They're taught to read eco mapping, but that knowledge is deeply embedded in a different way of being in relationship to the world. And that it needs to be, because that knowledge doesn't move students. It doesn't move us to transform our communities. And so the way that I think about it, one way that I think about it is during last summer, right when COVID was, happening or getting off the ground, was we launched our Resilience in Pandemic Times series. And there was a few different workshops that we did as part of that, but one of them was From Seeds to Songs, a musical journey with our plant relatives. And Danny Cornejo, who is from the Opata Nation, came and led that. And so it wasn't just a gardening class. It wasn't just a here's how you plant a seed that will then sprout in X amount of days that will produce X amount of food. It was how do you learn the stories of the plants that you're planting? How do you sing their songs? How do you actually develop a relationship to this plant? And how can that relationship then transform your life as well as allow you to see a plant as a relative? And that class was a huge success with young people. And because it was about all of the ways that young people are inherently good at understanding the world, which is through like song, through movement, through curiosity, through innocence, through wanting to develop a relationship. And what Western science will often tell us is this is an object to be observed. These are the data points. And that doesn't spark that sense of creativity or wonder that we really want to highlight and uplift at Mycelium. And then I think that's actually, I'll say, has also led to where we are in this moment in time where like, our current way of seeing the world around us is in a very siloed way where we're not having relationships with the food that we eat, with the water that we drink. And because of that, we just see them as commodities to be used and then dismissed. And we don't see ourselves in relationship with any of the world around us within a traditional system, right? It is very much about like self, maybe family, maybe just people, but when we don't actually create a relationship with the world around us, it is easy to abuse and to dismiss and to devalue everything that is not us.
Mm. Yes, I feel you. And yeah, I'm thinking about adultism and environmental and climate change movements. And the first thing that comes to mind is the reality that for so long, these movements were not made accessible to young people. And it was also often portrayed that young people didn't actually care. And this has changed a little bit, but adultism is still rampant. It just takes on different forms these days. So I'm curious to hear what critiques you have on this and specifically what you think is needed to empower young people in a way that is meaningful, but also prevents them from getting jaded about these movements over time.
That's a great question. And I think about it a lot because I hear when people hear that Mycelium does work with young people, or when we have amazing youth speakers, whether that's like through Mycelium directly or in the larger world. I think Greta is such a wonderful example of that. I hear a lot of adults saying things like, youth are so inspirational, or I feel so much hope when I see young people and the work that they're doing, or the opposite of that, which is just young people don't care. And so I feel like young people are placed in this false binary of either they're hopeful visionaries, or they just don't care and they're consistently connected with their phones. And I think about all the young people I directly talked to. And what really led me to start Mycelium was in conversation with young people who told me that they are terrified about the state of the world. And that almost every young person I've ever talked to has said that they have a deep fear about what the future holds. And so they go to marches and they go to protests, or they connect with each other online on social media. And then adults tell them, they might give them praise in that, youth are so inspirational kind of way, or they might get dismissed, like they're just always on their phones. And I think about how in both of these scenarios, we are not giving young people any inherent power to make real change in their lives. And I believe that like that is a form of adultism, and it's a way to dismiss young people, even when we say young people are so hopeful, but we're actually not taking any actions to ensure that young people have a livable future. That's adultism to me, because then young people are there to just serve our own needs and our own fears and our own despair about the future without actually us having to change anything about the way the system is created and is being run. And I think young people should have decision making power over aspects of their lives. And when I say that oftentimes is a radical view, like, what, they're so mature, they don't, they don't know enough. But I think that young people are also incredibly imaginative and innovative, and because they've actually experienced less socialization than adults, they're more willing to dive into out of the box thinking, and they're more willing to question the systems that we take for granted and assume will always be true. And I think that youth should be on school boards, for example. I think youth should be at all the places where decisions are being made, and they should actually be heard, because when we make decisions about the future of the world, when we take action or don't take action on a climate issue, we are having a direct impact into the lives of young people and into the world that they're going to age into. And I think if young people, like if any group is old enough to experience something, they're old enough to learn about why it exists and how they can have power to be able to change it. So I want us to be able to like think into that issue of like how young people should be in all the places where decisions are being made, especially around environmental issues, but also about their education. And it is wrong to assume that young people do not have opinions about things, or that they're not experienced enough to be able to tell us something, because they are the ones that are directly experiencing it.
You were going to see the city, looking for change. What a loaded word. You would never be the same, and your sighs were fogging up the windows, watching all the lights go in and out of frame like gold thread over black velvet. Did you hear it? What did the music sound like? 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 It's been a long ride, and it'll be a long ride.
I'm wondering, for listeners who aren't engaging in this realm, I wonder if you could speak to the power of BIPOC youth futurism and the sort of visionary nature that's created when young people are committed to an integrated approach to navigating climate change.
When I think of youth futurism, I think actually about one moment in Mycelium where we were looking at classes we wanted to offer last summer for young people. And one of the classes, I'm not an educator. I'm blessed to be surrounded by amazing educators who are fantastic at their craft. But one of the classes I do teach when I can is a Dungeons and Dragons class. And I kind of offered it as something I didn't think was going to be very important last summer, but it's something I'm really into. I am a huge sci-fi fantasy nerd, and it became one of the most popular classes at Mycelium Youth Network. And it was really surprising to me and to my exceptionally cool staff that Dungeons and Dragons was all of a sudden one of our most popular classes. And we were looking at having our first conference last year. And we did what we did normally when we don't know exactly how we're going to go about something, or when we need feedback, which is just go to young people. And so we had a young person focus group for students that have done mycelium before. And we asked them what they wanted to do. We're like, what do you want to, if you had 2 days to dive into anything, what do you want to dive into? And these were largely middle school, some high school young people. And they said that they actually wanted to play, and they wanted a space to game, and that they wanted to think outside of what was possible in that. And we ended up creating Apocalyptic Resilience, an Afro-Indigenous futuristic adventure. And we did that for several reasons. Like, one is we really wanted to meet young people where they were at. And where young people are at is in the amazing potential of futurism, but futurism that is grounded in Afrocentric or indigenous traditions, which I think is really important, because a lot of the sci-fi fantasy that we can read that is not that can be really depressing. It can be really apocalyptic, for lack of a better word. It can feel absent of community. And what I appreciate about Afro and indigenistic futurisms is that it often is pushing us to have, again, a different relationship with the world around us. It is more hopeful. It is less accepting of boundaries like racism, sexism, classism, and is trying to imagine something different in our world. And I think that young people flocked to the conference. We had about 140 people attend, about 70 of them were young people, during a time that we had heard that young people were so zoomed out. They came and they created characters where they were the heroes in their own adventures. And I think that when we open that up as a place of possibility, when we meet young people where they're at, when we allow them to be their incredible imaginative selves, and we give them the power to be able to do that in a way that is authentic, that what we have is a system, or we create a process in which, like, young people are able to blow every single expectation of what the world should be completely out of the water. And they're able to think collectively, they're able to build relationships with one another. You see this like innate sense of curiosity. There's so much there that young people are actually hungry for, because they haven't been taught it, and they want to dream big. And I think as we grow older, we get that dreaming big kind of, taken away from us, right? It's like conform. If you want a good job, conform. If you want to go to college, conform. And I really appreciate the ways in which young people consistently go back into this place of play, as a labor of love, and as a vision for all of us to be able to imagine something different.
Hmm. Thank you. I'm feeling so energized by what you just said. And I would like to transition into the practical makeup of Mycelium Youth Network. Some of your programs include Science for Survival, Clean Air is a Right, Air is Life, and Eco Mapping Our Present and Future. So I'm wondering if you could share what these programs look like and what is being taught, and potentially are there any upcoming programs that you're especially excited about?
Oh, yes. So the programs you mentioned are fantastic programs, and they all make up part of what we call our Climate Resilient Schools Initiative, which is us imagining schools as resilient centers or resilient hubs for the community around us. And what those are based off of is we will take a school, we will train young people to read NOAA data, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. We will train them to read different climate mapping tools. And then we will break down which issues are issues that they're likely to experience. And then we will do two things. We'll do climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So what are the ways in which we can mitigate damage around sea level rise, around drought, around fires, around different issues that are climate related. And then we'll also do climate adaptation. So if it's going to happen, then what do we do to be able to prepare for these different issues? And all of our Climate Resilient Schools initiative is next generation science standard aligned, so that it is easily able to be embedded within science standards at schools. We also have Water is Life, Clean Air is a Right, Growing Our Health, Food, Soil, and Carbon Sequestration. They're all around different, climate related issues. And those look like, again, starting from a place of social, emotional health, starting from ancestral traditions and knowledge. And then, so that can look like anything from, if we're doing a Clean Air is a Right, talking about the breath as a tool of grounding and of like meditation and mindfulness. It can look like the ways in which the breath and different breathing activities across different traditions and cultures has looked differently. But how it all goes back to us being able to ground into the truest version of ourselves. And then we will talk from that point about how to create a DIY air filter Then we will talk about how to create a detox box, because oftentimes the chemicals in our homes are more toxic than the chemicals outside of our homes. Then we will talk about how to make a tincture or a salve, and which are the plant relatives that we need to be able to bring in that medicine to our bodies. And so it is always we always start off from that place of, what does this mean for us, social and emotionally, ancestrally, culturally, and then how do we then dive into the technical, know-how. The other one of the programs I'm actually really excited about is our Telling Our Story program. We are partnering with Bioneers to train about 20 some odd young people from across the nation. So it'll be young people from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, connecting with young people from Louisville, Kentucky, connecting with people from New Mexico, connecting with people from Boulder, Colorado, and Denver, to look at environmental issues that are of concern in their area. Then they'll learn how to speak their truth to those particular issues. So they'll learn how to create podcasts, how to do video blogging, how to make a social media post go viral, how to do written journalism around these issues. And then we'll pay young people to actually be able to post and share out those stories, because that's another thing that we believe in, is that young people, if they put in the time and the labor, they should get paid for their work, and they should be valued for the work that they're doing. And so that's a program we're really excited about. We're really excited about our Gaming for Justice, which, I can talk about a little bit later, but which is a version of our Dungeons and Dragons curriculum, where we're looking at environmental justice issues. But those are some of our programs. And what we do, we also do like one-off workshops for communities. We've done last 2020, January 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago, we co-ran with Youth versus Apocalypse a youth resilience village, where we ran the Science for Survival station and just trained up young people on different climate preparedness, tools and techniques that they can use. So we've done things like that. We also do shorter sessions just around like kitchen herbalism or kitchen science, or a mini growing our health gardening class. We offer so many programs because we recognize that the climate change itself has there's so many issues we need to prepare for, and we're really trying to meet young people in the community where they're at to be able to provide solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder if some listeners might be thinking to themselves, who is decolonizing education for? And I think about this balance between remembrance and unlearning. Now, for myself, I know that if I had access to this sort of information earlier, it would have saved me from ultimately having to spend a great deal of time unspinning myself from the tangles of Western indoctrination. In a post titled "Keeping Bees at the End of the World," you write, quote, "We must return to our plant and animal relatives and to our own ancestral knowledge. If we are to survive, we need to learn what has been lost during the violent process of colonization. Imagine a Puerto Rico where there were thousands of community gardens, where everyone knew how to rebuild and water purification was the norm. Imagine a California where public education meant that youth were trained in creating defensible space against wildfires. Imagine a New Orleans where bayous were national treasures, so that when hurricanes hit, they slowed down enough to pose minimal danger," end quote. And so I'd like to ask for your reflection here and how you see decolonizing education engaging with public education, particularly for listeners who are parents and maybe have their children enrolled in public schools.
Right. So I think that I wrote that post, and I have to do a sad spoiler alert that my bees died because of the forest fires and because of climate change, which I was incredibly sad about. But I wrote that post because New Orleans in particular, Katrina had a significant impact on my life. And I grew up in New Orleans, and I had left a few years before Katrina hit to go to undergrad. And I didn't know for months on end if my father was alive, because he was in there, or my aunts and my uncles had to completely leave their homes for months. They weren't able to go back. And I remembered seeing these videos of people who were in almost all Black communities, who were in incredibly desperate straits, and nobody knew what to do. And I had this deep pain in my heart, and I still have it when I think about both Katrina, but then also, now we've seen in Puerto Rico, in Texas, here in the, also a United States case here in Texas. And I have this firm belief that the government as a whole uh, is not putting into place policies that show that they care about poor people of color. And I have a fundamental belief that the government will not save us. And by us, I mean poor people, communities of color in hard hit areas. We are already seeing the ways they are stripping us of so many right to vote, to just representation. And if we are going to say, like, if something is going to save us, it has to be us. And I think about how education is not meant to produce people that know basic skills, like how to purify water, for example, how to build a fire, how to keep warm in a blizzard, right? And there are things that we can do. There are fundamentally things that we can do in these situations, but we don't have the knowledge to be able, or we don't have access to the knowledge to be able to tap into that. And so when I think about a decolonial education, I think about relearning things that have been lost to us. I think about being able to train up for what's coming in the future, and not from a conspiracy theorist kind of perspective, but just like from the fact that when climate disasters happen, or when extreme weather happens, and when we say extreme weather now, what we consider extreme weather now is going to be, I feel like, the norm in 20 years, right? 10 years, is, if not sooner. But like, how do we respond? How do we create ways of being together, or of responding to emergencies that is different? And I get incredibly hopeful when I think about things like the mutual aid network that's happening right now, and the ways that people are actually saving other people, not governments saving us. And so I would like us to actually start, and instead of waiting for government to come around or to fix it, is to start saying, actually, no, we have the resources and we have the knowledge within our own communities to start rebuilding, to start relearning, to start remembering how to do all of these things. And, to take it back to New Orleans, my dad lives in New Orleans East. And there was an amazing documentary that came out about Vietnamese populations in New Orleans East, and how they were able to rebuild fairly quickly after Katrina, because they had already gone through so much upheaval at 3 or 4 different moments within their lives, right? Like transferring over, and how that community was able to rebuild itself because they were immediately able to start, connecting with other community members, start like distributing resources. Like they were like, hey, we got this rebuilding thing because we've had to do it so many times. And I think about, well, why can't we do that? Like, why can't that just be the norm of what we teach young people? Why can't we have something like mutual aid networks, and how to set up mutual aid networks, which is also a topic that our middle schoolers and high schoolers are really interested in learning, is like, how do we set up mutual aid networks to start like easily redistributing resources to one another, or to start doing skill shares to one another. And I think that for me is what decolonial education is that personal connection, that not waiting for governments or even nonprofits or corporations to come in and save us, that we actually we can train ourselves and we can train our communities in having the knowledge to be able to grow how we want to grow. And that to me is really beautiful and really hopeful.
And all the world's amalgamated flecks of color and supernatural floating landscapes set before your open eyes and picture boards. Golden ages, castle people, a pauper life, and a priest united. Sitting down at your kitchen table, social classes clash no more. Social classes clash no more.
Wow. I really love that you just said all that, because have been actually in multiple conversations about mutual aid and community empowerment versus big gov or big industry or policy, and just this maybe it's two sides of the same coin, or maybe that's not even the right metaphor, but I'm just thinking about the pressure put on communities that they can't empower themselves and they need big brother or empire to make sure they're okay, when really, when we look in history, that's never been the case and most likely never will be. So I am really grateful for you bringing that up again to our attention, that the power really lies within the community, and it always has and it always will. And yeah, in preparing for our conversation, I came across a report titled Preparing People on the West Coast for Climate Change that was put together by the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. And it concludes, quote, further, because traumatized and stressed people often withdraw into a self-protective survival mode left unaddressed, the harmful human psychological and psychosocial spiritual reactions to climate impacts also threaten to stall or derail efforts to reduce the climate crisis to manageable levels, end quote. And yeah, it's like we often hear about how mental health is suffering in context to climate grief and anxiety, but less so do we hear about the correlation between how well-being and personal preparedness impact our capacity for community resilience. And so I wonder if you could share a bit about the argument for integrated knowledge as a preemptive measure that will help stave off mental health crisis and violence, and perhaps even encourage us to have stronger social skills than what we have now.
Yeah, and before I answer that, I just want to quickly go back to the second question and also say, like, I think there is space to do both, but I think that if we wait for government to do it first, it's never going to happen. And I think that what I think is hopeful is the ways in which community action then grudgingly bring government along with it. And by that I mean, like, government kind of follows after we have a community action that is, or a community response. And so I think I always believe in like having community lead before government leads, but so I just wanted to just make that
thank you for
quick
that
point.
Yeah, appreciate it.
But like in terms of the ITRC, I love ITRC, and I think they're thinking really big in terms of what will be the mental health effects of climate change. And I think about how within our communities, or within like communities that are traditionally thought of as, again, like marginalized or disadvantaged, and these are all terms that I think are, for me, really hard because it doesn't embody who my community is. And, or, I think about like minorities, like these are all terms that for me are really difficult because we are so much more than that. And we are so resilient, and we carry with us both the legacy of intergenerational trauma, but we also carry within us so strongly the legacy of intergenerational healing, and how we have ancestors, my ancestors, I think in many ways, a lot of our ancestors who have died to preserve our ways of healing, whether that is within a Mexican tradition, doing limpias, whether that's doing like, herbal flower baths, whether that's doing prayer, whether that's the drum, in many different ways. Like we carry so much intergenerational healing, and how that is beautiful to me. And I think about how again, what is the value of education? What is the meaning? How are we redefining education? And that looks like for me incorporating a strong social and emotional dynamic into our curriculum. That's also what we're trying to do with our ancestral traditions. And so we want our curriculum to really match the social and emotional needs of young people. And I think that that's why young people resonate so strongly with our curriculum, is because some days we are actually talking about water catchment and water purification and the necessity of being able to access clean water. And some days we're actually just talking about how hard the world is right now for a young person, and creating open space to have that conversation. And Mycelium just finished our latest round of our affinity groups. We offer four different affinity groups. We offer our Talk Black to Me, which is the affinity group for Black youth, Queer and Teen, which is an affinity group for queer youth, Sacred Circles, which is an affinity for Native youth, and Inlakesh, which is an affinity group for youth activists. And our only point of being together in those spaces is to be together in those spaces. There's no agenda beyond what young people want to bring. And I think that when we think about a lot of times like mental health, it is something that we do as an afterthought, or it is something that is not as important as meeting next generation science standards and GSS science standards, but it is actually the work. And if we're going to prepare for the future, then we need to recognize that for a lot of our young people, we are already living in difficult environments because of how poverty and racism and heterosexism for a lot of our queer youth have played out over their lives. And so just taking a moment to slow down and recognize that, not as something extra that we have to do, but as the work itself that we have to do, I think is really important to being able to support young people in their mental health. And in even like when I say mental health, that feels kind of off to me because I'm like, we try to be holistic, and their mental health again feels like a siloed term. Like there's mental health and then there's physical health. No, it's all an interconnected system. And how do we support young people at every single angle or every single part of their system to be able to feel whole? And we can never talk about with young people, doing a STEAM project or even talking about the Run for Salmon if young people aren't in a mental place to deal with it because they just went through a trauma. And so just the need to really prioritize and highlight that social emotional health that is equally as important as the ancestral traditions and knowledge, and is completely wrapped up in the ways that we try to do it, but that is also equally important into the STEAM. And so we really want to create a system, and we've done this more and more as we start to develop out as an organization, but we want to create a system in which that knowledge is just as sacred and just as important as more traditional STEAM type activities. Because when things are incredibly hard, that's what we go to just ground ourselves to still feel human. And I think that often gets lost in conversations around education and meeting standards, is just that holistic heart education that for us is so vital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really agree with you. And I know that prior to your work with Mycelium Youth Network, you were looking at faith-based activism and liberation theology. And I know we could have a whole conversation on this alone, but I really do believe that having a spiritual practice or an orientation towards faith can really feed us in many ways in terms of our ability to commit to world-making practices. And I think mainstream environmentalism and climate change movements have really alienated themselves from this course of thought, for so many reasons. But as someone who has looked at the ways that religious faith can be connected to social activism, I wonder if I could ask you what you think the role of religious faith is in terms of transforming communities and building climate resilience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's not a question that we don't ask ourselves enough on the left. I think that as a whole, we have ceded religion and faith to the right. And I think it's been a detriment to us as a society. And I think that faith can be such a powerful vehicle to enact social change. My family is from Cuzatlan. My mother is from Cuzatlan, which is now known as El Salvador. And my family has a strong history of liberation theology. And I think about bringing faith into movements is about recognizing, again, that people are not driven by data. People are driven by deep seated beliefs, by stories, by connections. And also faith-based places like churches or mosques or like different cultural centers are incredibly important places to mobilize people. And the government, people generally don't trust the government, I think, for the most part, at least in my communities, they don't trust the government. But they will trust is a church or there's what's happening at their school. And so if we can start thinking about organizing, whether that is environmental justice organizing or labor organizing or whatever, as fundamental love for each other, and how it is a call to us to action, to put our faith in something larger, right? I feel like that's so much of organizing. We're putting our faith in the power of people to mobilize for something larger than us. I think that that is such a powerful way to tell people that they can bring their full selves forward and that we will hold them as a movement in their full selves, and that they don't have to check any part of themselves at the door. They don't have to silo their faith. They don't have to silo their politics, right? And then we can have really difficult conversations about the connections between faith and politics. And in the United States, we're taught that you don't talk, there are two things you don't talk about at the dinner table. Like, what is it? Faith and politics. And we're then telling people we don't have difficult conversations, that it is more important to keep a veneer of civility, quote unquote, at the dinner table than it is to, recognize that people are dying in the streets and they're dying from policies. And I think that it is okay for us to have difficult conversations. And I think that faith should be used to challenge ourselves to be the very best versions of ourselves that we can be for something larger than ourselves, whether that is for our community, whether that is for our planet, whether that is for the future generations that are going to come after us. Like, I think that unless we grapple with that conversation, we're not meeting people where they're at. We're assuming that we can win it in all of these different ways, when I don't think that we can. And I don't feel like we also have enough time to try to figure it out without faith and without bringing faith into the conversation. And so there's that study that says that we have until 2030 to make radical changes. Well, the things that people trust most are schools and communities, like community organizations and churches. And so let us actually start diving deep into those difficult conversations that we know are what shifts and changes people in their lives, rather than ignore it because we feel like we need to silo it because it is not for us. And I feel like, yeah, that's how we really make change in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so with you, and I'm so happy that we got to touch on that a bit, because I've been thinking about that more and more. And as we come to a close, I just want to talk a bit about normalizing our fear and channeling it into action. And I've heard you share that Mycelium Youth Network sort of came as a response to a movement in time where you were feeling a lot of anxiety for the future. And this is obviously so relatable to many, definitely including myself. And so I'd just like to ask what advice you'd offer to those who feel similarly now.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the same advice I would offer myself. I have such deep anxiety. And I'm starting to do better with my anxiety, but I oftentimes think my anxiety is very pragmatic. Um, but on a good day, it's very pragmatic. On a bad day, it's just hard to get out of bed. But I think that I have learned through doing this work that when my anxiety or when my fear rests just in fear and just in myself, and it is a tight ball in my chest or in my neck, it is incredibly debilitating. It is impossible. And every time I connect with others, every time I step into spaces where I am not prioritized and where I'm there in service of others, my fear, that like little ball in my chest or in my neck, kind of shrinks down. And I think that when we do work, when we commit ourselves lovingly to a cause that is larger than us while still practicing self-care. I think I'm all for self-care. So I don't want to say this is all just self-sacrifice, but when I am able to ground into something that feels larger than myself, and to do work for something that is larger than me, I feel that like knot in my chest slowly start unraveling. And then it is not just the work itself that does that, it is the connection and the communication with others. And when I'm able to share that with young people, or when I hear young people sharing that with each other, I see the ways that this thing that feels so scary and large becomes smaller and smaller and smaller the more it gets spoken. And I think there's so much power in just being able to share those stories with one another and knowing that we're not alone. And I hear from young people all the time that they wish adults would talk to them about this. And I get it. It's incredibly scary. Climate change is incredibly scary. It's scary for me, and I do this work all the time. I pour over this news like every single day. And at the same time, the more we speak it out loud, the more it becomes manageable, the more we can share, the more we create connection. And so I would say to speak it out loud as much as you can, to share it with those that are also afraid. I think if young people are old enough to experience it, they're young enough to be able to talk about it. They're young enough to be empowered to create solutions around it. There's so many amazing people doing groundbreaking work around climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And but we don't see any of that in the news. And so unless we start seeking that out, unless we start figuring out where those conversations are at, it's impossible to know that. And so my advice would be to share constantly, to be ready to grieve a tremendous amount that we've already lost, and to also, in sharing those stories, be prepared to empower young people, to empower yourself, to create visionary change. Because humanity to me is both so beautiful sometimes and so terrible sometimes. But the beautiful part is the ways in which we consistently adapt, and we are resilient, and we try, and we struggle, and we share. And I would say that is for me the most beautiful part. And it's when we don't do that, when we are just in our fear, that things can turn toxic, and then we see the worst of humanity. So I would definitely say talk to young people about it, share that you're afraid, share that you don't have any answers, if that's also the case. We don't have answers. We're just trying to figure out together what that looks like, but share that you're also willing to try to meet a young person where they're at in their fear, and you're willing to think about it with them. I think is incredibly powerful. I think if there's any organizations, Native organizations in particular, that are doing work in your communities, it's like moving beyond a land acknowledgement. I see a lot of nonprofits do land acknowledgement as if that's it. Right? Like, we acknowledge we sell this land for you and we're done. But also like seek out Native communities that are in your area, pay a land tax if it's, relevant to your community. Figure out what are the traditional ecological sources of knowledge that are there, support them wholeheartedly. Melinda Adams is another scholar that does amazing work in Northern California around traditional fires and traditional burns, and like support that work, that there's people out there that are doing visionary, groundbreaking work, and support them whether that's through funding, whether that's through showing up at event, whether that's through conversation, whether that's through sharing your story, and be prepared to walk humbly in it. Whether that's with a young person or somebody that you might have privilege over, be prepared to walk incredibly humbly and gently, because we're all trying to figure it out together.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. That's such an amazing way to, start to wrap up our conversation. But before we completely leave each other for this time, I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to share with listeners.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. I feel very old with social media. I'm not even that old, but I feel very old in social media. But follow us on social media. We have amazing people leading the work. We do offer classes virtually if you want to get involved in that. But I just want to say, there's one lesson I would have our viewers take away, or listeners, I should say, take away. It is to meet young people where they're at, because what is often seen within an adult culture as frivolous or silly is actually some of the spaces for really groundbreaking transformational work. And that to me is where young people are actually visionary and hopeful, and not just them giving a speech, right? So meeting young people where they're at and providing them a seat at the table, because they are going to go through it 1,000 times more than we are and have. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much, Lil. This has been just a really deep and beautiful time to share with you. So thanks so much for your work and for joining us on the podcast.
Yes, Glasuka Matli. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. The music you heard today was by Harry Foster, Leah Thomas, and Ian George. For the Wild is created by Ayana Young, Erica Ekram, and Francesca Glassbell.